Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm presenting on behalf of my team, which is people from ILRI and the Global Food Safety Partnership. So food safety is a public good. It affects public health. It affects food security, nutrition, livelihoods, incomes. But it's a public good that has to be delivered by private industry. So for the industry, it represents a bit of a challenge. Public health, the food safety is associated with three main sustainable development goals, at least. And it has increased, the interest on food safety in Africa and in other countries has increased a lot. Part of that is because in 2015, WHO released the first ever estimates of how much foodborne diseases were costing to the health of people in the world. So they indicated that foodborne illness was causing a health burden comparable to malaria or HIV or tuberculosis in the world. And not surprisingly, most of that burden is in children in sub-Saharan Africa. At the same time, in these countries, the food systems have evolving very fast too. And as countries grow a bit richer, they demand more animal source foods and vegetables, which are the riskier products when it comes to food safety. Also, consumers are getting more and more interested and concerned about food safety also in those countries. So that creates an environment in which there's a lot of interest, both nationally and internationally, to look at food safety and interventions to deal with it. Most of that interest, though, has been on aspects to do, rather than public health, to do with markets. There is an increasing interest on donors. Donors look at the food systems in Africa and they see that there is a lot of potential. There is an interest to grow trade. And the capacity needs in the country are still being defined. The food systems are very diverse across countries, within the countries. And all the donors are trying to understand what are the interventions and the investments that are more likely to be successful. So the Global Food Safety Partnership commissioned a project to have a look at what is happening on that space right now in terms of capacity building activities in Africa towards food safety, and somehow map and understand what is being done, who is doing it, and how it could be done better if needed. So we were involved in that study. And what we did is pretty much run some consultations to understand what projects were being undertaken with investments on capacity building. And capacity building was defined very broadly. So not only training and skills, but actually infrastructure and support to the food in the private sector. We wanted to highlight the patterns, see the trends on where things are going, and make recommendations. So we reviewed more than 500 projects, and that is also international. It's only international projects, so it doesn't include projects undertaken at the country level by national governments. It's only international donors and industry. We consulted more than 200 experts, including 55 structured interviews, and that helped us also map the landscape and the governance of the system. And with that, we reflected and made some recommendations. So a couple of slides on what we found. And the report is going to be released in the next few weeks, so obviously that will give all the details. But the highlights from the finding is that, well, from 2010 to 2017, which is the projects that we looked at, roughly there's been an investment on food safety in Africa of about $350 million US. It's a very rough figure. It's probably bigger than that because it was very hard to pull out, on multidisciplinary projects, what is the contribution to food safety in terms of budget. So it's very, very rough estimate. We also found that out of 20 donors that were working on that area, most of the funding in terms of budgets and in terms of number of projects were coming from just a few donors. The African Development Bank is actually getting more and more involved too. And then we also explored the role of development banks and bilateral funds that contribute to food safety and how they somehow can play a role into bringing different initiatives together and somehow streamline activities. So we had some of those to explore. In terms of what is being done and where, so most of the focus on food safety in the last 8 years in Africa has been primarily to support governments, to increase regulations, improve regulations. And most of the most of the focus has been on exports in formal markets. And in terms of food safety hazards, the focus has been on chemicals, and I guess aflatoxins is one of those that has taken a lot of these investments. And we observed that there's been almost no focus on public health capacity. So everything that happens after the value chain, so once the food gets to the consumer and it becomes a health problem. There's been very little investments on that front. And on risk research, trying to understand what are the hazards that are causing most of the risk and where should the investments be going. There's been almost, well, little investment in the informal sector, which are the markets that are feeding the domestic population, the national population. And there's been not much focus on microbiological hazards, which are the ones that cause the biggest part of that burden that I referred to at the beginning. And there's been very little also on consumer awareness and private sector capacity, assessing the capacity of the small and medium enterprises. So the report provides some recommendations, just looking at this landscape, let's say, that donors and national governments should be looking into. So we think when donors and private industry are thinking or investing on food safety in Africa, they should start by looking at the public health aspect of it, especially the public health burden. And as I said, primarily it's been, food safety is both an economic and a health issue, and it's been primarily looked at and driven by the market side of it. So we think there should be, if we really want to also have an impact on the health of people, we have to start looking at the problem from that side and start putting some investments on that, on increasing capacity there. The second is that all the investments should try and follow the Codex Alimentarius principles, which are about evidence-based actions and risk-based approaches. So trying to target what is it that matters for health and how we can address that. Third is because there's so many donors, well, there's many donors, many initiatives, and not necessarily well aligned. Everyone has their own interest and are putting investments into different areas. So there is a room for bringing these initiatives together and trying to think more globally and more, how to jointly address those problems. So that the way we somehow summarize that is trying to follow the principles of the Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness. So trying to also work with national governments, because that is something we also observe. There's not much connect between what the international donors are invested on and what the interest of the national partners are. There should be more integration there too. And finally, to recognize and catalyze and support the consumer and business part of the issue. Because after all, those are the ones that are going to be demanding food safety and delivering food safety eventually. So that's all. Thank you.